Ching Shih, the Empress of the Pearl River, the woman who would command 80,000 pirates and challenge the might of the Qing Empire, began her reign with a single stroke of a brush across parchment, transforming herself from grieving widow to the most powerful naval commander in Chinese history with nothing more than ink and iron will. Qing Shih stood at the bow of the crimson-sailed war junk as dawn broke over the Pearl River Delta, her silk robes whipping in the salt wind that had carried her husband's fleet to dominion over these treacherous waters. Behind her stretched an armada that defied comprehension, over 1,800 vessels of every description. From massive treasure ships bristling with cannon to swift riverboats darting between the larger craft like deadly minnows. The sight should have filled her with pride. Yet all she felt was the cold weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a funeral shroud. Zhang Yi was dead, struck down by fever at the height of his power, leaving behind the greatest pirate confederation in history and a young widow who understood that grief was a luxury she could not afford. The red flag fleet that her husband had forged from the scattered remnants of defeated rebel armies and dispossessed fishermen stretched across the horizon, a floating nation bound together by blood, profit, and the iron discipline that had made them masters of the South China Sea. But iron could rust and alliances could shatter, and without Zhang Yi's commanding presence to hold the confederation together, the fleet faced a very real possibility of dissolution into warring factions that would tear each other apart more efficiently than any imperial navy. The funeral had been concluded with all the ceremony befitting a pirate admiral who had styled himself Emperor of the Seas, his body committed to the waters that had given him power, while his captains gathered to determine the succession that would shape the destiny of thousands. The traditional choice would have been his eldest son, but the boy was barely 20 and had never commanded anything larger than a single junk. The pragmatic choice would have been Chang Pao, Zhang Yi's most trusted lieutenant and the closest thing to a son the admiral had ever acknowledged. But pragmatism, as Qing Shih had learned during her years as the wife of a pirate emperor, was often insufficient when dealing with men whose entire existence was built on violence and ambition. She had been born into a world where women were expected to be ornaments, valuable for their beauty and their ability to produce sons, but utterly powerless in matters of war and governance. Her original name was lost to history, erased by the transformation that had made her first Zhang Yi's concubine, then his wife, and now something unprecedented in Chinese history, a woman who would dare to claim authority over men who had never acknowledged any law, but strength and any loyalty, but to their own interests. The girl who had once sold her body in a floating brothel on the Pearl River had learned to read the currents of power as expertly as any navigator read the tides. The meeting that would determine her fate took place in the great cabin of Zhang Yi's flagship, a converted Qing Dynasty war junk whose scarlet sails had become a symbol of terror from Macau to the Vietnamese coast. The assembled captains represented every faction within the Confederation. Former Imperial Navy officers who had defected rather than face defeat, rebels whose villages had been destroyed by government forces, merchant captains who had found piracy more profitable than legitimate trade, and savage sea wolves whose loyalty extended no further than the next successful raid. Each man in that cabin commanded dozens of ships and thousands of followers, making them warlords in their own right, who had consented to serve under Zhang Yi's banner only because his success had made them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Chang Pao spoke first, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge the grief they all shared while making his own claim to succession. He had served as Zhang Yi's right hand for nearly a decade, leading the most dangerous raids and negotiating with both imperial officials and foreign merchants who sought safe passage through pirate-controlled waters. His knowledge of the Confederation's operations was unrivaled. His courage in battle was legendary, and his loyalty to the Red Flag Fleet was absolute. By any traditional measure, he was the obvious choice to succeed his fallen commander. But tradition, as Qing Shih rose to address the assembly, was about to encounter revolution. She spoke in the clear, carrying voice that had once entranced customers in a floating brothel and later charmed foreign diplomats at her husband's formal receptions. but her words carried an authority that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. She did not claim leadership based on sentiment or feminine appeal, but on the cold calculation that the Confederation's survival depended on maintaining the careful balance of power that Zhang Yi had established among the competing factions. Chang Pao's appointment as supreme commander, she argued, would upset that balance by concentrating too much power in the hands of the military faction, potentially alienating the merchant captains and former imperial officers whose support was essential to the Confederation's continued success. Zhang Yi's young son lacked the experience necessary to hold such a diverse coalition together, while any of the individual flag commanders would be seen as partisan choices that favored one faction over the others. The only solution that preserved unity while maintaining stability was a regency arrangement that would distribute authority among the Confederation's key leaders while preserving the symbolic continuity represented by Zhang Yi's bloodline. What she proposed was unprecedented in Chinese history: a woman serving as regent and supreme political authority over the Confederation, while Chang Pao retained command of military operations and the various flag commanders maintained their tactical autonomy within their respective fleets. It was a solution that appealed to no one's pride but served everyone's interests, which made it both politically brilliant and personally dangerous for the woman who had conceived it. The debate that followed revealed the complex currents of ambition and fear that ran beneath the Confederation's surface unity. Some captains argued that placing a woman in authority, even nominally, would be seen as weakness by both their enemies and their own crews, inviting challenges that could destroy everything they had built. Others pointed out that Qi Shih had already demonstrated her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of pirate politics, serving as her husband's trusted advisor and negotiating successfully with everyone from Portuguese traders to Qing Dynasty officials. The deciding factor, as it so often was in the pirate confederation, came down to money. The Confederation's wealth flowed through a complex network of tribute payments, protection fees, and legitimate business ventures that Qi Shih had helped establish and continued to oversee. Her knowledge of these financial arrangements was comprehensive, while her connections with foreign merchants and corrupt officials were invaluable assets that could not be easily replaced. More importantly, she controlled access to the Confederation's accumulated treasure, estimated to be worth millions of silver taels, which gave her a form of power that even the most ambitious captain had to respect. The compromise that emerged from those tense negotiations established a new form of government for the Pirate Confederation that combined traditional Chinese concepts of regency with the practical necessities of managing a maritime empire built on violence and extortion. Qi Shih would serve as supreme civil authority, responsible for political negotiations, financial management, and the overall strategic direction of the Confederation. Chang Pao would command the military forces, leading raids and defending the Confederation's territory against imperial attacks. The flag commanders would retain their operational independence while acknowledging the overall authority of the regent and her military commander. To legitimize this unprecedented arrangement, the captains agreed to a formal ceremony that would transform Qi Shih from a grieving widow into something that had never existed before in Chinese history: a female pirate emperor. The ritual drew on ancient Chinese traditions of imperial succession while adapting them to the unique circumstances of the Pirate Confederation. She would take the name Ching Shih, meaning widow of Zhang, which acknowledged her connection to the Confederation's founder while establishing her own distinct identity as its new leader. The transformation ceremony took place on the anniversary of Zhang Yi's death, conducted aboard his flagship in the presence of the entire fleet. 1,800 vessels formed concentric circles around the central ceremony, their crews witnessing the moment when a woman dared to claim authority over the largest maritime force in the world. The ritual itself combined elements of traditional Chinese imperial investiture with pirate customs that emphasized the democratic nature of their confederation, creating something entirely new in the annals of naval history. When the ceremony concluded and the crimson flags dipped in acknowledgement of their new commander, Ching Shih found herself in possession of a power that was both absolute and precarious. She commanded more ships than many imperial navies, controlled territory that encompassed hundreds of miles of Chinese coastline, and possessed wealth that rivaled that of European monarchs. But her authority rested on the continued consent of men who had spent their lives taking what they wanted by force, and any sign of weakness or failure could trigger a rebellion that would destroy both her and the confederation she now led. The early months of her reign tested every aspect of the political skills she had developed during her years as Zheng Ye's wife and advisor. The captains who had agreed to serve under her authority watched her every decision for signs of feminine weakness or political naivety, while foreign observers waited to see whether a woman could maintain control over forces that had grown accustomed to masculine leadership. Her own crews, many of whom had never served under female authority, required careful management to prevent the kind of disciplinary problems that could undermine her position among the other commanders. Her first major test came when Portuguese merchants in Macau attempted to renegotiate the protection agreements that had guaranteed safe passage for their ships through pirate-controlled waters. The merchants, perhaps believing that a woman would be more malleable than her deceased husband, offered terms that would have significantly reduced the Confederation's income, while providing fewer guarantees of Portuguese neutrality in any conflict with imperial forces. Their miscalculation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the woman they were dealing with, and Ching Shih's response would establish her reputation as a negotiator who combined feminine subtlety with piratical ruthlessness, rather than simply rejecting the Portuguese proposals. She orchestrated a demonstration of the Confederation's power that drove home the consequences of underestimating her authority. A carefully coordinated series of raids targeted Portuguese shipping throughout the Pearl River Delta, capturing valuable cargoes while avoiding the kind of violence that might provoke a military response from Macau's colonial government. The message was clear. The Confederation's new leader was fully capable of enforcing her will through economic pressure, but she preferred negotiation to unnecessary bloodshed. The Portuguese quickly returned to the bargaining table with proposals that not only maintained the existing tribute arrangements, but actually increased payments in exchange for enhanced protection guarantees. The successful resolution of the crisis accomplished several objectives simultaneously, demonstrating to her own captains that feminine leadership could be as effective as masculine aggression, proving to foreign observers that the Confederation remained a formidable force under her command, and establishing her personal reputation as a leader who combined strategic thinking with tactical flexibility. But the Portuguese negotiations, for all their importance in establishing her credibility, were merely a prelude to the much greater challenges that would define her reign as the Empress of the Pearl River. The Qing Dynasty, having tolerated pirate activity in the south as long as it remained relatively contained, was beginning to recognize that the Confederation under Ching Shih's leadership represented a threat to imperial authority that could not be ignored indefinitely. The woman who had once sold her body in floating brothels now controlled naval forces that could challenge the emperor's own fleet, and her growing influence among the coastal populations threatened to inspire other rebellions against Qing rule. The imperial response, when it came, reflected both the traditional Chinese approach to dealing with maritime threats and the specific challenges posed by an enemy who combined legitimate naval power with intimate knowledge of local conditions. Rather than attempting to destroy the Confederation through direct military confrontation, imperial strategists hoped to divide and weaken the pirate alliance through a combination of bribery, amnesty offers, and targeted attacks on the Confederation's most vulnerable economic interests. The strategy might have succeeded against a traditional pirate organization led by men whose primary loyalty was to their own immediate interests. But Ching Shih had spent her early months in power creating institutional structures that bound the various factions together more tightly than ever before. Her greatest innovation was the establishment of a comprehensive legal code that regulated everything from the distribution of booty to the treatment of captives, creating a system of pirate law that was more consistent and predictable than the imperial justice system that most of her followers had experienced. The pirate code that she promulgated drew on traditional Chinese legal principles, while adapting them to the unique circumstances of maritime life. It established clear procedures for resolving disputes between captains, standardized the tribute rates that merchant vessels were expected to pay for safe passage, and created a system of military discipline that maintained order within the Confederation's diverse forces. Most importantly, it established her own authority as the final arbiter of disputes and the ultimate source of justice within the Confederation, giving institutional weight to her personal power. The Code's provisions regarding the treatment of women revealed the complex relationship between Ching Shih's gender and her authority over a force composed almost entirely of men, rather than ignoring the sexual dynamics that inevitably arose in an all-male environment. She addressed them directly through regulations that protected captive women from rape, while establishing clear procedures for managing romantic relationships between pirates and their female prisoners. The regulations were pragmatic rather than idealistic, recognizing that complete elimination of sexual violence was impossible while attempting to minimize its disruptive effects on military discipline. Her handling of gender issues within the Confederation demonstrated the political sophistication that had enabled her rise to power in the first place. She neither attempted to eliminate traditional gender roles, nor allowed them to undermine her own authority, instead creating a system that acknowledged the realities of her situation, while protecting her position as supreme commander. Female captives who chose to remain with the Confederation could earn protected status as wives or concubines of individual pirates, while those who preferred repatriation were treated as valuable commodities whose safe return could be negotiated for political or economic advantage. The implementation of the Pirate Code required a level of administrative sophistication that surprised both supporters and enemies of the Confederation. Ching Shih established a bureaucracy that rivaled those of many legitimate governments, with specialized departments responsible for intelligence gathering, financial management, diplomatic negotiations, and military planning. The headquarters of this maritime empire was located on a fortified island in the Pearl River Delta, where captured imperial officials were impressed to find a functioning government that maintained detailed records, conducted formal ceremonies, and operated according to established procedures rather than the arbitrary whims of individual commanders. Foreign observers who visited the pirate capital during this period left accounts that revealed their amazement at the level of organization and discipline they encountered, rather than the chaotic collection of lawless brigands they had expected. They found a sophisticated maritime power that controlled trade, routes maintained diplomatic relations with foreign governments, and operated according to legal principles that were often more consistent than those of the imperial government. The woman who presided over this unprecedented achievement had transformed herself from courtesan to empress through a combination of political acumen, strategic vision, and an iron will that even her most ambitious subordinates had learned to respect. The Confederation's growing sophistication inevitably attracted increased attention from the Qing imperial government, which could no longer dismiss the southern pirates as a minor regional nuisance. Reports reaching Beijing described a maritime empire that challenged imperial authority, not through simple banditry, but through the establishment of alternative governmental structures that threatened to inspire similar rebellions throughout the empire. The woman who commanded this challenge to imperial authority had become more than a pirate leader. She was a political revolutionary whose success called into question the fundamental assumptions of Chinese governance. The imperial response reflected both the seriousness with which the court now viewed the pirate threat and the limitations of traditional Chinese military doctrine when confronted with an enemy who controlled the sea lanes essential to the empire's economic survival. The emperor dispatched additional naval forces to the south, while simultaneously attempting to negotiate with moderate elements within the Confederation who might be willing to accept amnesty in exchange for abandoning their allegiance to Ching Shih. The imperial strategy of attempting to divide the Confederation through selective amnesty offers revealed a sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics that held the pirate alliance together, but it also underestimated the institutional reforms that Ching Shih had implemented to strengthen the Confederation's unity. The legal code she had established created shared interests that transcended the personal loyalties that had bound individual captains to Zhang Yi, while the administrative structures she had developed gave even minor commanders a stake in the Confederation's continued success. More importantly, her own position as Supreme Commander was now supported by a network of relationships and the obligations that went far beyond the personal charisma that had initially enabled her rise to power. The bureaucracy she had established was staffed by individuals whose careers depended on the Confederation's continued existence, while the economic arrangements she had negotiated with foreign merchants created powerful incentives for maintaining the political stability that made those arrangements possible. The first serious test of these new institutional arrangements came when imperial agents approached Chang Pao with an offer that would have made him an admiral in the Imperial Navy while providing amnesty and substantial financial compensation for any followers who chose to join him in abandoning the Confederation. The offer was carefully crafted to exploit potential tensions between the Confederation's civil and military leadership, and its generous terms suggested that Beijing was willing to pay almost any price to divide the pirate alliance. Chang Pao's response to the imperial overture revealed both the strength of the institutional bonds that now held the Confederation together and the personal loyalty that Ching Shih had inspired among her key subordinates. Rather than seriously considering the offer, he immediately informed her of the contact and provided detailed intelligence about imperial plans to subvert the Confederation's unity. His decision to remain loyal, despite the obvious advantages of accepting imperial amnesty, demonstrated that the Confederation had evolved beyond a simple alliance of convenience into something approaching a genuine, alternative government with its own sources of legitimacy and loyalty. The unsuccessful attempt to bribe Chang Pao marked the beginning of a more aggressive imperial campaign against the Confederation. As Beijing officials recognized that political subversion alone would not be sufficient to destroy the maritime empire that Ching Shih had created, the escalation of the conflict would test every aspect of the organizational innovations she had implemented, while providing opportunities to demonstrate that a woman could lead military forces as effectively as any male commander in Chinese history. The Imperial Navy that now moved against the Confederation represented the largest maritime force that the Qing Dynasty had ever assembled, with over 60 major warships supported by hundreds of smaller vessels and carrying nearly 40,000 marines and sailors. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Li Chongqing, a veteran of the dynasty's successful campaigns against Taiwanese pirates, who had been specifically chosen for his experience in naval warfare and his reputation for aggressive tactics. But Admiral Li's conventional naval background, while impressive by imperial standards, had not prepared him for the kind of warfare that the Confederation had perfected during its years of dominance over the South China Sea. Ching Shih's forces operated according to principles that combined traditional Chinese naval doctrine with innovations developed through practical experience in maritime combat, creating tactical approaches that confused and frustrated opponents trained in more conventional methods. The Confederation's greatest advantage lay in its intimate knowledge of the Pearl River Delta's complex geography, which included hundreds of hidden channels, fortified islands, and shallow waterways that could accommodate the pirates' shallow draft vessels while remaining inaccessible to the larger ships of the imperial fleet. Ching Shih had spent months preparing for the inevitable confrontation by establishing supply bases throughout this maze of waterways, creating a logistical network that would allow her forces to maintain extended operations even if they were forced to abandon their main bases. The opening engagement of what would become known as the Pirate War took place near the mouth of the Pearl River, where Admiral Li attempted to use his numerical superiority to trap a substantial portion of the Confederation's fleet against the coast. The battle revealed both the strengths and limitations of the opposing forces. As the Imperial Navy's superior firepower clashed with the pirates' superior maneuverability and local knowledge, Ching Shih commanded the Confederation's forces from her flagship, a massive war junk that mounted nearly 50 cannon and served as both a symbol of her authority and a practical command center for coordinating the complex maneuvers that pirate tactics required. Her presence on the battlefield sent a powerful message to both her own forces and her imperial opponents, demonstrating that she was willing to share the dangers that she asked her followers to face, while providing visible proof of her continued control over the Confederation's military operations. The battle itself unfolded according to patterns that would characterize the entire conflict, as the Confederation's forces used their superior knowledge of local waters to avoid decisive engagement while inflicting maximum casualties on their imperial opponents, rather than attempting to match the imperial fleet's firepower through direct confrontation. The pirates employed hit-and-run tactics that exploited the cumbersome nature of large warships operating in confined waters. The result was a frustrating stalemate that left Admiral Lee with tactical control of the main shipping channels but unable to eliminate the pirate threat or protect merchant vessels from continued harassment. The Confederation had demonstrated that it could not be destroyed through conventional naval warfare, while the Imperial Navy had proven that it possessed sufficient strength to prevent the pirates from operating openly in the most important commercial waterways. The strategic implications of this initial engagement would shape the conduct of the entire war, as both sides recognized that ultimate victory would depend on political and economic factors rather than simple military superiority. Ching Shih understood that her confederation could not survive indefinitely under the pressure of sustained imperial attack, while Admiral Lee realized that his conventional forces were inadequate to eliminate an enemy who refused to fight according to traditional rules of naval warfare. The months that followed the opening battle saw both sides attempting to gain decisive advantage through strategies that went far beyond simple military confrontation. The imperial government offered increasingly generous amnesty terms to individual pirate commanders, while simultaneously attempting to disrupt the Confederation's economic base by interfering with the tribute arrangements that generated much of its income. Ching Shih responded by expanding her forces' raiding activities to demonstrate that imperial protection of merchant shipping remained ineffective, while using her diplomatic connections to negotiate with foreign powers who might provide support for her continued independence. The most significant development during this period was the Confederation's evolving relationship with Portuguese authorities in Macau, who found themselves in the delicate position of maintaining neutrality between two Chinese powers while protecting their own commercial interests. The Portuguese had initially hoped to remain uninvolved in what they viewed as an internal Chinese conflict. But the increasing intensity of naval combat in waters essential to Macau's survival forced them to take positions that inevitably favored one side or the other. Ching Shih's negotiations with Portuguese officials revealed the sophisticated understanding of international politics that she had developed during her years as the Confederation's leader. Rather than simply demanding Portuguese support for her cause, she offered arrangements that would benefit Macau's commercial interests while providing her forces with access to European weapons and naval technology. The proposed agreements would have transformed the Portuguese colony into a de facto ally of the Pirate Confederation, providing a secure base for operations while offering European merchants unprecedented access to the lucrative markets that the pirates controlled. The Portuguese response to these overtures was cautious but interested, as colonial officials recognized both the opportunities and dangers that closer cooperation with the Confederation might entail. Supporting Ching Shih could provide enormous commercial advantages and protection from imperial retaliation, but it would also inevitably involve Macau in a conflict that could result in Chinese military action against the colony itself. While these diplomatic maneuvers continued, the military conflict intensified as both sides attempted to gain advantage through increasingly aggressive tactics. The Imperial Navy began targeting the Confederation's civilian supporters, attacking fishing villages and merchant communities that were suspected of providing aid to the pirates. These operations violated traditional Chinese military ethics and generated significant opposition among the coastal populations who had previously remained neutral in the conflict. Ching Shih's response to imperial attacks on civilians demonstrated both her political sophistication and her understanding of the propaganda value of positioning herself as a protector of ordinary people against imperial oppression. Rather than simply retaliating against imperial forces, she organized relief efforts for communities that had suffered from naval bombardments, while publicizing imperial violations of traditional military codes that prohibited attacks on non-combatants. The effectiveness of this approach became apparent as coastal populations increasingly turned to the Confederation for protection against what they viewed as imperial tyranny. Villages that had previously feared pirate raids now welcomed Confederation forces as liberators, while merchant communities began openly supporting Ching Shih's political claims, despite the obvious risks that such support entailed. The growing popular support for the Confederation created new challenges for imperial forces, who found themselves fighting not just an organized pirate fleet, but a revolutionary movement that enjoyed significant civilian backing. Admiral Li's conventional military approach proved inadequate for dealing with an enemy who combined naval power with popular support, guerrilla tactics, and sophisticated political organization. The imperial court's recognition of these changing circumstances led to a significant shift in Beijing's approach to the pirate problem, as officials began to consider political solutions that had previously been rejected as unacceptable compromises with criminality. The woman who had begun her career selling her body in floating brothels had transformed herself into a political leader, whose demands could no longer be dismissed as the fantasies of a criminal organization. The negotiations that would ultimately end the pirate war began through intermediaries who recognized that both sides had reached positions that made continued military confrontation counterproductive. The imperial government could not eliminate the Confederation through naval warfare alone, while Ching Shih understood that her forces could not indefinitely resist the resources that the empire could bring to bear against them. The preliminary discussions revealed the extent to which the conflict had evolved beyond a simple law enforcement operation into something approaching a civil war between competing visions of Chinese governance. Ching Shih's demands included not only amnesty for her followers, but formal recognition of the Confederation as a legitimate political entity with continued authority over substantial territories and populations. These demands struck at the heart of imperial political theory, which claimed universal jurisdiction over all Chinese territories and populations. Accepting the Confederation as continued existence as a quasi-independent political entity would establish precedents that could encourage other rebellions throughout the empire, while rejecting any compromise would condemn both sides to a prolonged conflict that neither could definitively win. The breakthrough came when Ching Shih demonstrated her willingness to accept a face-saving compromise that would allow the imperial government to claim victory while preserving the essential elements of the Confederation's autonomy. Her proposal involved the formal surrender of the pirate fleet in exchange for the incorporation of her forces into the imperial navy, with herself and her key subordinates receiving high-ranking positions that would effectively maintain their authority over their former followers. The terms she proposed were unprecedented in Chinese history, as they would have made her the highest-ranking female military officer in the empire, while maintaining the Confederation's essential unity under the nominal authority of the imperial government. The arrangement would transform pirates into imperial naval officers while preserving the organizational structure that had made the Confederation such an effective maritime force. The imperial court's deliberations over these proposals revealed the extent to which Ching Shih had succeeded in changing the fundamental dynamics of the conflict. Rather than dealing with a criminal organization that could be suppressed through military force, Beijing was now negotiating with a legitimate political entity whose cooperation was essential for maintaining stability in the strategically vital Pearl River Delta. The final agreement that ended the pirate war represented a compromise that satisfied the essential interests of both parties while avoiding the mutual destruction that continued conflict would have ensured. Ching Shih accepted imperial authority over her former domain while retaining practical control over the forces that had made her the most powerful woman in Chinese history. The empire gained nominal control over the southern waters, while acknowledging the reality of the Confederation's continued existence under imperial auspices. The ceremony that formalized this agreement took place with all the pomp that Chinese political tradition could provide, as the woman who had challenged imperial authority was formally welcomed into the service of the throne she had opposed. The symbolism was carefully crafted to emphasize imperial magnanimity in victory, while acknowledging the legitimate achievements of a worthy opponent who had earned her place through demonstrated competence rather than traditional social connections. When the formalities concluded and the crimson flags of the Confederation were lowered for the final time, Ching Shih found herself in possession of an imperial rank that made her one of the most powerful officials in the empire. Her transformation from courtesan to pirate empress to imperial admiral represented a journey through Chinese society that defied every conventional expectation about the possibilities available to women in traditional Chinese culture. The integration of the former Confederation into the Imperial Navy proved remarkably successful, as Ching Shih's forces brought to their new roles the same discipline and effectiveness that had made them formidable opponents. Her knowledge of southern waters and her relationships with local populations made her invaluable in suppressing the smaller pirate bands that continued to operate throughout the region, while her administrative innovations improved the efficiency of imperial naval operations. But perhaps her greatest achievement was the precedent she had established for female leadership in a culture that had traditionally confined women to domestic roles. Her success in commanding forces that numbered in the tens of thousands, negotiating with foreign powers, and ultimately achieving a political settlement that preserved both her authority and her followers' welfare demonstrated possibilities for women that had previously existed only in legend and fantasy. The years following her integration into the imperial system saw Ching Shih consolidating her position as one of the most influential figures in southern China, using her official authority to protect the interests of the populations that had supported her during the Pirate War, while building relationships with imperial officials who recognized her value as both a military commander and a political leader. Her personal life during this period reflected the same careful balance between convention and innovation that had characterized her public career. She married Cheng Pao in a ceremony that formalized their long partnership, while maintaining the social respectability that her new position required. The marriage represented both a personal relationship and a political alliance that strengthened her position within the imperial hierarchy, while preserving the loyalty of her former subordinates. The children born from this union would grow up as members of the imperial nobility, their father's official rank and their mother's achievements providing them with opportunities that would have been unimaginable for the offspring of pirates and courtesans. Yet their existence also represented the ultimate vindication of their mother's revolutionary journey from the margins of Chinese society to its very center. As Ching Shih aged, her legend grew beyond the historical facts of her career to encompass the hopes and dreams of countless Chinese women who saw in her story proof that the rigid limitations of traditional society could be overcome through courage, intelligence, and determination. Her transformation from prostitute to pirate to imperial admiral became a powerful symbol of the possibilities that existed for those willing to challenge conventional expectations and create their own destinies. The records of her later years reveal a woman who had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of imperial politics while maintaining the essential elements of her identity that had enabled her rise to power. She continued to display the same combination of pragmatic calculation and bold vision that had characterized her leadership of the Confederation. Applying these qualities to the challenges of governing within the imperial system rather than in opposition to it. Her death, when it finally came, marked the end of an era in Chinese maritime history. The woman who had commanded the largest pirate fleet in history had lived to see her former enemies acknowledge her achievements and accept her contributions to the stability and prosperity of the empire she had once challenged. Her funeral was attended by imperial officials, foreign diplomats, and thousands of ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her remarkable career. The legacy of Ching Shih extends far beyond her specific achievements as a pirate leader and imperial admiral. Her story became part of the cultural inheritance of Chinese women, providing an example of female empowerment that transcended the particular circumstances of her era. In a society that had traditionally limited women's roles to those of daughters, wives, and mothers, she had demonstrated that feminine intelligence and determination could achieve the highest levels of political and military authority. Her innovations in naval organization, diplomatic negotiation, and political administration influenced Chinese maritime policy for generations after her death, while her legal code provided a model for regulating complex multi-ethnic organizations that other imperial officials would study and adapt. The administrative structures she had created to govern the Confederation proved their worth in imperial service, contributing to the efficiency and effectiveness of Chinese naval operations throughout the 19th century. But perhaps her most important legacy was the proof she provided that the rigid social hierarchies of traditional Chinese society were not immutable barriers to individual achievement. Her journey from the floating brothels of the Pearl River to the highest levels of imperial authority demonstrated that merit and determination could overcome even the most disadvantaged social origins, inspiring generations of Chinese people to pursue their own paths to success despite conventional limitations. The woman who had begun her adult life selling her body to strangers ended it as one of the most respected figures in Chinese society, a transformation that challenged every assumption about the possibilities available to women in traditional Chinese culture. Her story became a permanent part of Chinese folklore, inspiring countless retellings that emphasized different aspects of her character and achievements, while consistently portraying her as a figure who had transcended the limitations of her gender and social origin through exceptional ability and unwavering determination. In the end, Ching Shih's greatest victory was not any single battle or negotiation, but the complete transformation of her social identity from that of society's most marginalized member to its most powerful leader. She had proved that, in a world governed by strength and intelligence, gender and social origin were less important than the courage to seize opportunities and the skill to make the most of them. The years of imperial service that followed the end of the Pirate War revealed new dimensions of Ching Shih's remarkable abilities, as she adapted her revolutionary leadership skills to the more subtle challenges of bureaucratic governance and imperial court politics. Her official title as Admiral of the Black Flag Fleet carried with it responsibilities that extended far beyond simple military command, encompassing everything from coastal defense to diplomatic relations with foreign powers, who continued to view her with a mixture of respect and apprehension. The administrative reforms she implemented within the imperial naval system drew heavily on the organizational innovations she had developed during her years as leader of the Pirate Confederation. The bureaucratic structures that had enabled her to coordinate the activities of 1,800 vessels and 80,000 followers proved equally effective in managing the Imperial Navy's operations throughout southern Chinese waters, bringing unprecedented efficiency and discipline to forces that had previously been hampered by corruption and incompetence. Her approach to naval warfare, refined through years of conflict with imperial forces, revolutionized Chinese maritime military doctrine in ways that would influence naval operations for generations. The hit-and-run tactics that had proven so effective against Admiral Li's conventional fleet became standard operating procedures for imperial forces dealing with pirates, smugglers, and foreign intruders. Her emphasis on local knowledge and flexible command structures replaced the rigid, hierarchical approaches that had previously characterized Chinese naval operations, creating a more adaptive and effective fighting force. But perhaps her most significant contribution to imperial governance was her ability to maintain stability and loyalty among populations that had previously been sources of rebellion and unrest. The coastal communities that had supported her during the Pirate War continued to provide intelligence and cooperation to imperial authorities, not from fear of punishment, but from genuine respect for a leader who had consistently protected their interests and understood their needs. The transformation of former pirates into effective imperial naval officers presented unique challenges that tested every aspect of Ching Shih's leadership abilities. Men who had spent years living according to their own laws and following their own interests had to be convinced that service to the emperor offered advantages that outweighed the freedom they had sacrificed. Her success in achieving this transformation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human motivation that went far beyond simple command authority. She accomplished this integration through a careful combination of practical incentives and symbolic recognition that acknowledged her followers' previous achievements while channeling their energies toward imperial service. Former pirate captains found themselves commanding imperial vessels that were often superior to the ships they had previously owned, while ordinary sailors discovered that imperial pay and benefits exceeded what they had earned through piracy, especially when the risks and uncertainties of their former profession were taken into account. More importantly, she ensured that the sense of brotherhood and shared purpose that had bound the Confederation together was preserved within the imperial system. The personal loyalties that had sustained her followers through the dangers of pirate life were redirected toward service to the empire, creating a network of relationships that made her naval forces more cohesive and effective than traditional imperial units. The foreign diplomatic community in Canton and Macau watched these developments with fascination and concern, recognizing that the woman who had once challenged imperial authority had become one of its most effective defenders. Portuguese officials who had negotiated with her during the Pirate War found that she brought the same combination of pragmatic flexibility and iron determination to her imperial role, making her both a valuable ally and a formidable opponent in commercial negotiations. British merchants who had suffered losses during the Pirate War initially approached her with suspicion, but gradually came to appreciate the stability and security that her naval forces provided for legitimate commerce. The protection arrangements she negotiated with foreign traders were more consistent and reliable than anything the imperial government had previously offered, creating conditions that facilitated the expansion of international trade throughout the Pearl River Delta. Her personal relationship with Chang Pao during these years reflected the same careful balance between private affection and public necessity that had characterized her entire career. Their marriage had formalized a partnership that combined genuine emotional attachment with strategic political advantage, creating a power-sharing arrangement that maximized both their individual effectiveness and their collective influence within the imperial system. Chang Pao's role as her principal military subordinate allowed him to maintain the respect and loyalty of former Confederation forces, while providing her with a trusted lieutenant whose competence and loyalty were beyond question. His knowledge of naval tactics and his relationships with individual commanders complemented her broader strategic vision and political skills, creating a leadership team that was more effective than either could have been individually. The children born from their union represented both the personal fulfillment that had long been denied to her and the ultimate vindication of her revolutionary journey through Chinese society. Their existence proved that a woman who had been written off as a prostitute and criminal could create a family legacy that would endure within the highest levels of imperial society, establishing bloodlines that would carry her achievements into future generations. The education she provided for these children reflected her deep understanding of the skills and knowledge necessary for success within the imperial system. They received traditional Chinese classical education that prepared them for careers in government service, while also learning the practical skills of navigation, military command, and diplomatic negotiation that had made their parents successful. The combination created individuals who were uniquely prepared to bridge the worlds of traditional Chinese culture and maritime adventure that had shaped their family's remarkable story. As her children grew to maturity, they faced challenges that reflected both the advantages and burdens of their extraordinary heritage. Their mother's achievements had opened doors that would have been closed to the offspring of ordinary officials, but her unconventional background also created expectations and suspicions that they had to navigate carefully throughout their careers. The eldest son, trained in both classical scholarship and naval warfare, eventually achieved high rank within the imperial bureaucracy, while maintaining the maritime interests that had defined his family's rise to prominence. His success demonstrated that the combination of traditional Chinese culture and practical seafaring knowledge could produce leaders who were effective in both civilian and military roles, validating his mother's approach to education and career development. The daughters faced more complex challenges, as Chinese society offered fewer opportunities for women to achieve independent success, despite the precedent their mother had established. Nevertheless, the marriages they contracted and the social positions they achieved reflected the elevated status that their mother's accomplishments had secured for the entire family, demonstrating the intergenerational impact of her revolutionary career. The naval base that Ching Shih established on her home island became a model for imperial maritime installations throughout southern China, incorporating both the defensive innovations she had developed during the Pirate War and the administrative efficiencies she had perfected in managing the Confederation. The facility served not only as a military installation, but also as a center for maritime research and development, where new ship designs and naval technologies were tested and refined. Her interest in technological innovation reflected the same forward-thinking approach that had characterized her political and military leadership. She recognized that naval supremacy in the modern world would increasingly depend on technological advancement rather than traditional seamanship, and she invested considerable resources in acquiring and developing the latest weapons and navigation equipment available from European sources. The relationships she maintained with Portuguese and British arms dealers provided her with access to cannon, small arms, and naval architecture that gave her forces significant advantages over traditional Chinese naval units. These technological improvements, combined with the superior training and discipline that her organizational methods produced, created naval forces that were arguably the most effective in East Asian waters. Her collaboration with European military advisors during this period revealed another dimension of her remarkable adaptability, as she demonstrated the ability to learn from foreign military traditions while preserving the essential elements of Chinese naval culture that gave her forces their distinctive character. The hybrid approach she developed combined the best features of Eastern and Western naval doctrine, creating tactical methods that were uniquely suited to the geographic and political conditions of the South China Sea. The intelligence network she established throughout the Pearl River Delta and beyond provided the imperial government with information capabilities that had previously been unavailable to Chinese authorities. Her contacts among merchant communities, fishing villages, and foreign trading posts created a comprehensive system for monitoring threats to imperial security, while identifying opportunities for expanding Chinese influence and commerce. This intelligence operation drew on the same networks of personal relationships and mutual obligation that had sustained the Pirate Confederation, demonstrating that the social capital she had accumulated during her years as an outlaw leader could be successfully transferred to legitimate governmental purposes. Former pirates who had been her eyes and ears throughout the maritime world became imperial agents whose loyalty was guaranteed by personal devotion rather than simple financial incentives. The information gathered through these networks proved invaluable in dealing with the smaller pirate bands that continued to operate throughout Chinese waters after the collapse of the main confederation. Her intimate knowledge of pirate methods and psychology enabled her to anticipate their movements and counter their tactics with unprecedented effectiveness, gradually eliminating the maritime banditry that had plagued Chinese commerce for centuries. Her success in suppressing piracy throughout her area of responsibility led to requests from other imperial officials for advice and assistance in dealing with similar problems in their own jurisdictions. The methods she had developed for transforming pirates into productive members of society were studied and adapted throughout the empire, contributing to a general improvement in maritime security that facilitated economic development and international trade. The legal precedents established through her integration into the imperial system had implications that extended far beyond her individual case, creating new possibilities for other unconventional leaders who might seek to transition from opposition to collaboration with imperial authority. Her example demonstrated that the empire was capable of adapting to changing circumstances by incorporating talented individuals regardless of their backgrounds, providing a model for political flexibility that would prove valuable in dealing with future challenges. The scholarly works that began to appear during her later years, documenting her methods of organization and command, contributed to the development of Chinese military science in ways that influenced strategic thinking for generations. Her innovations in logistics, personnel management, and tactical coordination were studied by military academicians who recognized that her practical experience had produced insights unavailable through traditional theoretical approaches. The memoirs she dictated during her final years provided historians with unprecedented insight into the inner workings of Chinese piracy and the social conditions that had made the Confederation possible. Her descriptions of life aboard the pirate fleets, the relationships between different factions within the Confederation, and the negotiations that had led to her integration into the imperial system became primary sources for understanding one of the most remarkable periods in Chinese maritime history. These documents also revealed the personal costs of her extraordinary career, the sacrifices she had made, and the prices she had paid for achieving power in a world that had never before acknowledged female leadership. Her reflections on the loneliness of command, the constant vigilance required to maintain her position, and the weight of responsibility for thousands of followers, provided a humanizing counterpoint to the legend that had grown around her achievements. Her relationship with traditional Chinese literature and philosophy, developed through intensive study during her years of imperial service, demonstrated intellectual capabilities that complemented the practical intelligence she had always displayed. Her ability to quote classical texts and engage in scholarly discourse with educated officials helped to legitimize her position within the imperial hierarchy, while providing her with additional tools for exercising influence and authority. The poetry she composed during this period, following traditional Chinese forms while incorporating imagery and experiences drawn from her maritime background, represented a unique contribution to Chinese literature that bridged the worlds of classical culture and seafaring adventure. These works, preserved in imperial archives, provide insight into the inner life of a woman who had experienced the full range of human possibilities. Within Chinese society, her patronage of arts and literature during her prosperous later years reflected both genuine cultural interests and astute political calculation, as she recognized that supporting traditional Chinese culture would help to establish her respectability within elite circles, while demonstrating her transformation from outlaw to pillar of society. The scholars and artists she sponsored produced works that celebrated both imperial authority and the maritime traditions that had shaped southern Chinese culture. The charitable works she undertook, particularly those focused on improving conditions for women in similar circumstances to those she had experienced in her youth, revealed a social consciousness that had been shaped by personal experience of society's lowest levels. Her support for institutions that provided alternatives to prostitution and her advocacy for legal reforms that protected women's rights demonstrated a commitment to social improvement that went beyond simple personal advancement. The schools she established for the children of her former followers ensured that the next generation would have access to educational opportunities that would enable them to succeed within the imperial system while preserving the maritime skills and traditions that had made their parents effective naval personnel. This investment in human capital reflected her understanding that lasting social change required generational transformation rather than simply individual advancement. Her involvement in commercial ventures during her later years demonstrated the same entrepreneurial spirit that had enabled her rise to power, as she recognized that economic success would provide a foundation for her family's continued influence within imperial society. The trading companies she established, the shipping operations she managed, and the financial institutions she supported created a business empire that complemented her official authority while providing independent sources of wealth and influence. The international recognition she achieved during her lifetime, as European and American observers acknowledged her as one of the most significant figures in East Asian politics, provided validation for achievements that had initially been dismissed by conventional Chinese society. Foreign diplomats who met her during official functions invariably commented on her intelligence, dignity, and political sophistication, creating a body of international opinion that reinforced her domestic reputation. Her correspondence with foreign officials, preserved in various national archives, reveals a woman who had mastered the subtle arts of international diplomacy while maintaining her essential Chinese identity and loyalty to imperial interests. Her ability to negotiate effectively with representatives of very different cultural traditions demonstrated the same adaptability that had enabled her success in every other aspect of her remarkable career. The medical knowledge she accumulated through years of caring for wounded sailors and dealing with the tropical diseases that plagued maritime expeditions made her a valuable advisor to imperial officials dealing with public health challenges throughout southern China. Her practical experience with naval medicine, combined with her access to European medical knowledge through foreign contacts, created expertise that was unique within the imperial bureaucracy. Her contributions to the development of Chinese naval architecture, based on her extensive experience with vessels of every description, from swift riverboats to massive ocean-going war junks, influenced shipbuilding throughout the empire and beyond. The design innovations she sponsored combined traditional Chinese craftsmanship with European technological advances, producing vessels that were superior to anything previously available to Chinese naval forces. The agricultural reforms she implemented on her personal estates reflected the same systematic approach that had characterized her management of the Pirate Confederation and her leadership of imperial naval forces. Her introduction of new crops and farming methods, her investment in irrigation and transportation infrastructure, and her fair treatment of tenant farmers created model communities that demonstrated the benefits of enlightened agricultural management. As her influence grew within the imperial system, she became an informal advisor to other high-ranking officials who sought her counsel on matters ranging from military strategy to personnel management. Her reputation for practical wisdom and her proven ability to achieve results made her opinion valuable even in areas outside her official responsibilities, extending her influence throughout the imperial bureaucracy. The religious and philosophical beliefs that sustained her through the various transformations of her career reflected a sophisticated synthesis of traditional Chinese thought with the practical ethics that had emerged from her maritime experiences. Her patronage of Buddhist and Taoist institutions, combined with her support for Confucian educational programs, demonstrated an inclusive approach to spiritual matters that mirrored her pragmatic approach to political and military challenges. The funeral preparations she made during her final years reflected both her desire to be remembered as a respectable member of imperial society and her recognition that her unconventional background required special attention to ceremonial proprieties. The elaborate arrangements she specified, the charitable bequests she established, and the memorial institutions she endowed were designed to ensure that her legacy would be preserved in forms appropriate to her achieved status within Chinese society. When death finally came to the woman who had commanded the largest pirate fleet in history, it found her surrounded by the wealth and respect that her extraordinary abilities had earned through decades of service to the empire she had once challenged. The funeral that followed was attended by representatives of the imperial court, foreign diplomats, and thousands of ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her remarkable journey from society's margins to its very center. The eulogies delivered at her funeral acknowledged both her unique achievements and her contributions to imperial security and prosperity, creating an official record that established her place in Chinese history as one of the most significant figures of her era. The monuments erected in her honor, the institutions that bore her name, and the traditions that continued her work ensured that her influence would extend far beyond her individual lifetime. The Empress of the Pearl River had sailed into legend, leaving behind a wake of shattered expectations and expanded possibilities that would continue to inspire those who dared to dream beyond the conventional limitations of their time and place. Her crimson sails had disappeared beneath the horizon of history, but the course she had charted toward female empowerment and social transformation continued to guide those who followed in her revolutionary wake. The girl who had sold her body in floating brothels had become the woman who proved that, in China, as everywhere else, merit and determination could triumph over the most disadvantageous circumstances, creating possibilities that had never before existed and inspiring changes that would echo through the centuries that followed her extraordinary life.